Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be debunking another one of these CTMU critics that have absolutely nothing of value to say insofar as we're talking about the content of the CTMU and criticizing it, and result to smears or an attempt at a smear. Now, a lot of you have been asking me to do a long format video debunking Professor, he's not a real professor, he's not even a scientist, to debunk Professor Dave, his critique, which is doing a lot of charity. That word, the usage of the term critique, is a huge charitable donation to whatever the fuck that piece of dog shit was. Today I'm gonna be doing this quick one because it is quite an easy dunk to get, and I'm just gonna be pumping these out because it does kind of bother me to see retards like this that have absolutely nothing of value to say just repeat the same thing because they're likely atheist idiots. So the matter of the fact is, actually, it's so funny because if you think about it like this, if Chris Langan was an atheist, literally nobody would give a fuck. Nobody would care. If Chris Langan was an atheist or he was left wing, he would not. Nobody would care, right? Is purely on the basis of a political motivation, and that does not even need to be demonstrated because we're just gonna refute the arguments that this person gives. And they're relatively a nobody. I mean, but people have viewed this video called Chris Langan is a Charlatan. So it's 5 minutes, short, concise. So it requires a short and concise debunk. That's why I'm going to be publishing the Professor Dave video a little bit later. And so, yeah, let's get started.
Chris Langan has long been a figure of fascination and controversy. Touted as the smartest man in America due to an IQ reportedly exceeding 200, Langan has captured public imagination as an underdog genius, someone whose intellectual potential seemingly transcends traditional structures like academia or corporate leadership. However, a closer examination of his claims, intellectual contributions, and public persona suggests that Langan's reputation may rest more on self-promotion and mystique than on substantive achievements.
Firstly, self-promotion of what? Of his IQ test? Because a lot of people make this proposition. All of the claims that have been about Chris Langan's IQ have been made by third-party sources, every single one. And if we're going to be talking about, oh, his IQ test scores are dubious, they were reported on ABC News, whom took him to a official neuropsychologist who proctored his IQ test, and he did it for 2 hours, and it was documented live on ABC News. So, I mean, if you want to make the proposition that ABC News was conspiring to prop up Chris Langan as a Christian genius with a new theory of everything to take over the world, yeah, it's not going to work. And I hope the person is not stupid enough to try to attempt that kind of an argument because it's so easily refutable. So yeah, that's the case. And at a deeper glance into Chris Langan's work, that's funny you say that because nobody has, and all the critics of the CTMU have not read the CTMU, or even if they have, they mischaracterized it as a scientific theory, which Chris Langan has literally never called a scientific theory. It's not, because it's a metaphysical theory of everything. It's a philosophy. You don't go to Hegel and say, but where's the empirical testing for this? That's not the measure of a valid philosophy, and same way that it's not a measure of a valid scientific theory to ask, well, how can this be logically deducible? How do we do the premises and the formal logical representation of this in mathematical logic and prop logic? Yeah, it doesn't work like that. That's not what science or the scientific method does. Two completely different systems.
His work fails to withstand scrutiny, while his cult of personality overshadows his inability to deliver meaningful contributions to knowledge.
Meaningful by whose metric? By your metric, somebody who's not read the CTMU? Meaningful by whose metric? It seems like if you're going to make the proposition that Chris Langan is a charlatan, which you deem to be an objective proposition, or at least I assume is an objective proposition that you're making, because if it's subjective, why would literally anybody give a fuck that you think he's a charlatan? You should use an objective metric, saying, I feel like he's made no contributions, meaningful contributions. That's a completely subjective parameter. Contributions to what? Academia? Somebody doesn't need to make contributions to academia in order for them to make valuable, meaningful contributions. The CTMU is intelligible, it is meaningful, and it is the only coherent theory of everything that is metaphysically valid. And so, yeah, if you want to argue about the CTMU, you're going to have to do it on the basis of the propositions that are contained within the CTMU, which not a single one of these critics have been able to do.
Langan's rise to prominence is rooted not in groundbreaking discoveries or impactful work, but in his narrative, a high IQ individual from humble beginnings who defied the system. While this narrative is undeniably compelling, it sidesteps an essential question: what has he accomplished?
He's created a metaphysical theory of everything, a philosophy, standing on the shoulder of giants. Yeah, I mean, in comparison to every single other philosopher preceding him, he has the most technical metaphysical theory of everything. If you're going to be comparing Chris Langan to other people in his domain, you need to be comparing him to people in his domain. And his domain is philosophy. Okay, it's not. He's not a scientist, because he's not an academic either, right? Because he didn't finish college. He didn't. Yeah. So what kind of proposition are we making here? Are we making the proposition that you can't make any meaningful contributions in any capacity unless you attend academia and engage in academic masturbation? Doesn't work, dude. It's stupid.
Historically, figures like Albert Einstein or Alan Turing demonstrated their brilliance through transformative contributions to science and mathematics.
Yeah, they're fields, they're particular fields, and Chris Langan has done that in his field of work, which is philosophy. Now, if you want to argue that, you're going to have to do that on the basis of the grounds of his domain or his field. Haven't done that because you can't. You can't.
Langan, in contrast, has not produced a body of work that aligns with his purported intellectual capabilities.
Yeah, he has. It's called the CTMU. It's a cognitive theoretic model of the universe. It's a metaphysical theory of everything, and it completely lives up to the title, which it is granted itself, which is theory of everything. If you want to debunk that, you're going to have to debunk that the CTMU is a metaphysical theory of everything, which you, for some reason, for some just arbitrary reason, I don't think you're going to do. It's totally not on the basis of the fact that every single CTMU critic has not been able to do that yet. And you, a minute in, and it doesn't seem like you're going to be doing that either.
Central to his intellectual legacy is the cognitive theoretic model of the universe.
Yeah, let's get
a
talking
philosophical
about that.
framework he claims unifies science and religion. Despite the ambitious scope of this theory, it is mired in opaque language, lacks empirical support.
Oh, the philosophy lacks empirical support? You mean scientific, like being tested by the scientific method? Because that's not what a philosophical theory is tested upon the basis of. It's tested upon the basis of logical argumentation. The CTMU makes logical propositions, and in order to verify whether these logical propositions are correct, you do that using logic. You do that using propositional logic. You do that using mathematical logic. And you see whether the propositions that he's making are coherent, intelligible, consistent, and actually have premises that are sound and have conclusions that are valid upon the basis of the connectivity with the premises, which every single one of them does. And not you nor any other CTMU critic has been able to show otherwise. That's all you can say. All you can say is it's failed to do so, or it's wired in opaque language. Can you tell us which of the language is opaque? Can you tell us which of the terms are unclear, that are undefined? Because they're in the CTMU and they're clearly defined within the CTMU. Have you read the CTMU? Of course not.
And is largely inaccessible to rigorous academic critique. Indeed.
Academic critique? Which fields are we talking about? Are we talking about science? Are we talking about science? Are we talking about physics? The CTMU is not a theory in physics. It's the CTMU is a theory in philosophy. Which philosophers have read the CTMU and have decoded it, or have analyzed it and shown problems with the logical propositions that are being made, or have debunked it by means of a logical syllogism, or have debunked it by literally any kind of logical deductive means? Not a single one. They don't exist. You're dumb.
Langan's explanations often devolve into semantic gymnastics.
Semantic gymnastics is another way to say I have no clue what he's talking about because I don't understand it, and I have no justification for my proposition that Chris Langan's propositions are unfounded. If you want to say that Chris Langan says something false or his theory is invalid and meaningless, you're going to have to make propositions that justify such a position. You haven't been able to do that because you have no clue what you're talking about.
More an exercise in linguistic obfuscation than a
I
coherent
exercise in linguistic obfuscation. Okay, demonstrate that. Demonstrate which parts of the CTMU are linguistic obfuscation and which parts of the CTMU have propositions or words or terms, neologisms that are not clearly defined or are not defined in the scope of the theory and are not completely coherent and logically deducible within the scope of the theory. You're not going to be able to do that.
argument. This tendency has led many to suspect that his theory functions less as a genuine intellectual contribution and more as a means of reinforcing his image as an enigmatic genius.
Notice the proposition that is being made. It makes people think, it makes people feel like, it makes people perceive it in a particular way. None of it is about the CTMU making a false proposition. The way that the CTMU is written, the way that people interpret the CTMU upon the basis of the abstract that they read, upon the basis of the little snippets of an interview they might see of Chris Langan talking about the CTMU, may get other people to believe that that Chris Langan is not making a legitimate contribution. They're not making that proposition on the basis of reading the CTMU and trying to make an actual attempt at reading and understanding the CTMU within the confines of a logical framework and a logical metaphysical framework, but rather they just think that. They just think that. It's not strong, it's not an argument, it's not a proposition that the CTMU is actually false or invalid as a theory of everything, insofar as we're talking about a philosophical theory of everything that encapsulates a basis for understanding anything past, future, or present. It doesn't do that. You're not making an argument here. You're just saying other people think this way as well and they feel like this. Yeah, make an argument, dog. If you want to debunk the CTMU, if you want to be debunking it, and say that Chris Langan is a charlatan on the basis of his CTMU contributions or his lack thereof, then show how it is a lack thereof. You're not doing it. All you're saying is other people think, I think. Make a proposition and justify.
Another hallmark of a charlatan is their reliance on personal branding to maintain credibility. Langan has leaned heavily on his high IQ as a
yeah, because he has a high IQ. Yeah. Yeah, well, why? What is that an ethical problem? Is that a moral problem? Is that something that minimizes his capacity for his theory to be logically valid and correct? Does that minimize that? Can you justify any of these? None of these people justify any claims ever. Ever. It doesn't happen. It doesn't occur.
Badge of authority, often using it as a shield against critics.
He doesn't. Again, it's a way of marketing. He literally doesn't. He's literally never brought up his IQ as a shield from criticisms, because there's been no criticism of the CTMU on the grounds of the contents of the CTMU themselves. If there have been criticisms against the CTMU on the grounds of the propositions of the CTMU themselves, it's from people who believe in the CTMU. Because the people who actually read the CTMU and comprehend it and understand it and study it, those are the people that have the most questions about the CTMU, not idiots like you.
Emphasizing his intellectual superiority, he frames dissenting opinions as the result of lesser minds being unable to comprehend his ideas.
No, it's more so an inability to try, because you haven't tried. You don't even know what the CTMU stands for. That's why none of these people ever debate. They never debate. Especially Professor Dave. He's fucking terrified of debating anybody on anything that isn't about the flat earth or evolution. Terrified. He'd never do it. Ever. He wouldn't even do it about political issues, which he's so passionate about, upon the basis of which motivated him to create the hit piece on Chris Langan. He wouldn't ever debate philosophy against anybody. He's an idiot, just like you.
This tactic,
Chris Langan doesn't do that, by the way. He appeals to ignorance. He says you're ignorant of the CTMU because and aided by evidence, because again, notice that in the very critique that you're making of him, you're not bringing up anything from the CTMU itself. So yeah, you're kind of justifying the proposition that he's making upon the basis of which he calls people like you ignorant. He doesn't call you stupid unless you troll in his comment section or whatnot. He doesn't call you stupid unless you try to defame him, which many people try to do, like you're trying to do right now, and you try to smear him, which is what you're trying to do right now. Notice that you're never bringing up a proposition from the CTMU itself, and he's completely justified in calling you ignorant.
effective in cultivating a loyal following, undermines the principles of open dialogue and critical examination.
Critical examination, like you haven't done at all, and neither has literally any other CTMU critic upon the basis of a philosophical analysis, because you have to criticize a philosophy on the basis of philosophy. You don't criticize a scientific theory on the basis of philosophy, because a scientific theory is not a philosophy, dumbass. A scientific theory is a scientific theory. A philosophy is a philosophy. So if you want to criticize the CTMU, by all means, go ahead. Open up the CTMU, go principle by principle. And these idiots don't know that there are a list of principles upon which the worldview of the CTMU is created and constructed. You can literally go, if you have a problem with the CTMU, you can go principle by principle and see which one of them doesn't make sense. None of you do that. You don't mention the reality principle. You don't mention syndiphianesis. You don't mention SCSPL. You don't mention any of these things because you don't have anything. All you have is, he's marketing and the word's really hard and I don't like it and other people don't like it. Therefore, I'm justified in feeling this way. No, you're actually not. You're spineless.
That underpin genuine intellectual progress. Moreover, Langan has displayed
genuine intellectual progress, like you avoiding the CTMU right now, like you not bringing up anything from the CTMU right now.
A penchant for dismissing academic institutions and scholars.
Yeah, people that dismiss his work without reading it. Yeah, and also academic institutions insofar as they engage in dogmatism. Yeah, that's completely justified. It's completely justified. Are you going to be able to tell us why that's not justified? To dismiss academic institutions, or academics in particular, to dismiss his theory on the basis of science, even though his theory is not a scientific theory, it's not pertaining to a particular scientific field, or it's not even attempting to be a scientific theory, it's attempting to be a theory of everything. Do you think that academia has a monopoly on these things? It doesn't.
Portraying them as intellectually constrained or politically motivated. While it is true that academia is not without flaws, Langan's wholesale rejection of it serves to isolate his work from the rigorous...
Langan doesn't wholesale reject academia. He acknowledges that academia has good sides, and he also acknowledges that academia has bad sides. But the only problem is that the bad sides are not capable of being... They're not capable of being corrected because people have a monopoly on academia. That's his entire point. There are people that have a monopoly on academia. The academia and education is supposed to be in service to the people, and it has become the problems and the issues. If we have a good system and it has defects, as people who are beneficiaries of the system and the people that are what the system is made for, we can try to change or modify these negative effects. But if the system itself is monopolized by people that incapacitate us from modifying these negative effects, then of course we're going to say that this institution, this system, has a major has a major intrinsic, inherent, essential problem, and that's what Chris Langan has said.
Scrutiny that might validate or disprove it. This approach has the dual effect of...
Nobody has disproven it. Chris Langan hasn't stopped anyone because that's the proposition that is being made. Chris Langan is trying to stop people from intellectual discourse on his CTMU. He's not doing that. He's welcoming people to do it. He only challenges people on the precedent of their intelligence or their ignorance when they literally do the same thing that you're doing right now, and you're not bringing up the CTMU at all. You're not bringing up any principle, any logical proposition, any content, any informal argument against the CTMU. You're not doing anything.
Preserving his ideas from critique, while enabling him to cultivate an image as a maverick thinker persecuted by the establishment. A defining feature of pseudoscience is the appearance of intellectual rigor.
Oh, we keep doing this. A defining feature. So they give you increments of what might apply to other people and try to categorize somebody like this, like Chris Langan, amongst the same generalization that they're making. No, that's not how it works. If you want to make a proposition about somebody in particular and their work, you're going to have to apply it universally amongst all of the propositions that are contained within their work and see if it actually applies to the standard that you're talking about and see if it actually is pseudoscience. Now, the reason that it is literally impossible for CTMU to be pseudoscience, do you know why? Do you know why the CTMU can't be pseudoscience? Because it's not a fucking scientific theory, you dumbass. It's not. Philosophies can't be pseudoscience because a philosophy isn't a science. A philosophy isn't a scientific theory, more so. You realize that, right? You understand that a philosophy can't be a pseudoscience because a philosophy is not a scientific theory. As long as it's not attempting to market itself as a scientific theory, which Chris Langan hasn't. He's never called the CTMU a scientific theory pertaining to any particular domain of science. Then what's the issue here? All you're doing is Chris Langan is very mean, and you're making mischaracterizations of his work, which he has literally never said. The CTMU has never proclaimed to be a scientific theory. It's literally, but categorically, by definition, it's impossible for the CTMU to be pseudoscience because it's not a science. It's not a scientific theory. The same way that a cat can't be a dog, because by definition, these things don't go together. The presence of one necessitates the absence of the other.
Without the substance. The CTMU, with its dense terminology and metaphysical claims, fits this mold. Langan's
the CTMU is a pseudoscience because it includes metaphysics. Do you understand what metaphysics is? It's a field in philosophy, so it literally can't be pseudoscience unless it's proclaiming to be a scientific theory, which the CTMU isn't doing. Like, these people they're just establishment shills that have no understanding of any of these things. They don't have the basic rudimentary understanding of philosophy necessary to even read fucking Plato, let alone the greatest philosophical work since.
Writing often employs complex jargon that gives the impression of deep insight.
Complex jargon? Can you point to what is complex jargon that is not defined? It doesn't make coherent logical sense, and it isn't consistent within the confines of the theory, and it hasn't been justified within the confines of the theory. Can you name one? Of course not. It's just really, really hollowed words. Really hollowed words.
While masking a lack of empirical foundation.
It doesn't need to have an empirical foundation because it's not a scientific theory. Again, this keeps going over their fucking head. It's not a scientific theory. What are you missing? You even said it's a philosophy. Yeah. It is not marketing itself to be a scientific theory. It's marketing itself to be a theory of everything, which has the groundwork theoretical framework to be able to explain the basis upon which anything else can be justified. That's what a theory of everything is in philosophy. It is the necessary foundations of a worldview for things to even be intelligible. Things like science and empiricism, these are lower order manifestations of a theory of everything. They can't be intelligible unless an epistemology is defined, unless a metaphysics is defined, unless the logical confines by which the prior two are defined is defined. The CTMU does all of these things, and you haven't been able to show how they don't, or how it doesn't.
For example, terms like infocognition and self-configuring self-processing language may sound profound, but lack the...
It's not about them sounding profound, it's about them having definitions. You're saying that these are...
clear definitions and testable predictions...
yeah, they don't have testable predictions. These are propositions in metaphysics. These are terms in metaphysics. How can you go about... Can you tell me how you can physically test for the noumena and the phenomena? These are claims... These are concepts within the framework of the philosophical framework of Immanuel Kant. Do you go looking for empirical... Oh, where's... Immanuel Kant's philosophy is pseudoscience. Do you understand how dumb that sounds? Infocognition is the coupling of information and cognition. It is a substitute for idealism and physicalism. Now, you may be like, well, what does this have to do with science? It doesn't. It's a philosophy. These are philosophical notions. This is a philosophical divide that has occurred since the very basis of philosophy and its instantiation. And Chris Langan has solved it by proposing a middle ground of infocognitive monism. Infocognitive monism means that reality is based on, or the format of cognition upon which we can interpret reality is based on a coupling of information and cognition. And these are two sides of the same coin, because you can't have cognition without information, and you can't have information without cognition, solving the divide and the gap between the divide between physicalism and idealism, and basically emancipating the vague notions of dualism that have existed in philosophy by positing a dual aspect monism. And that's what the infocognitive term is for. That's what infocognition is for. It's the coupling of information and cognition. It's the notion that information and cognition are inseparable, meaning mind and information are equal in the creation and the generation of reality.
Required for scientific theories. This style mirrors...
It's not a scientific theory. Yeah, that's not the standard by which you judge it, because it's not a scientific theory. How many times do I have to say this? It's almost like I'm talking to a retarded person.
Used by other self-proclaimed intellectuals who blur the...
Oh, and did he say the STSPL? Yeah, STSPL means a self-configuring, self-processing language. What do you not understand about that? Pretty simple. Yeah, self-configuring, it configures itself. Self-processing, it's a language that processes itself. Language, it's a language. And it's a metaphysical term. It's not a scientific term. It's not a proposition about, hey guys, there's this new phenomenon. How about we go test for it using some technology? It's not a scientific theory. How about we go test the hypothesis? No, that's not how it works. It's using the CTMU is generated through the means of logical induction, and the propositions that are made within it can be deducibly verified. Now, can you refute it? Can you provide a single logical syllogism that refutes the basis of infocognition or STSPL? Of course you can't. You don't even know what these things are.
Line between philosophy and science to create an illusion of authority.
Between philosophy and science? It's a philosophy. It's a metaphysical theory. He said so himself numerous times. He said that in the Kurt Jaimungal interview. He said that in every single bit that he has about the CTMU, or every website that you can look up about the CTMU that has information on it. All of us creators that are CTMU content creators have always defined it as the theory of everything, a metaphysical theory of everything. You can't find Chris Langan calling it a scientific theory. So, because it's not how it's marketed, it's not how it's foundationalized. It doesn't work like that. You're just making it up. Sorry. It doesn't fit with your narrative. It's cute. It doesn't fit with your narrative, but I'm sorry, it doesn't.
By presenting his work as too advanced for conventional minds, Langan shifts the burden of proof onto his audience, effectively daring them to disprove ideas that are...
Yeah, because he's fulfilled the burden of proof, and you're saying that he hasn't, so that's on you to demonstrate. If somebody said, I have this... if somebody makes a set of propositions and they've laid out a series of justifications for their propositions, and I say, no, you're wrong. Now I've made an assertive claim. Now I've made an assertive proposition, and I need to justify it. Can you justify that any of the propositions within the CTMU are false? That's what you're alluding to. Chris Langan hasn't said, you just have to prove my statements false. This would only be a valid criticism if he didn't provide justifications for his propositions, which he has. It's in this little document called the CTMU. It's in this little document called the metaformal system. It's in this little document called quantum metamechanics. It's in this little paper called... literally every single paper and work that he's done. They're all about philosophy and metaphysics and the incorporation of a theory of everything into this kind of framework.
Are often too vague to engage with meaningfully. Langan's self-presentation as a misunderstood genius is not merely an individual quirk. It reflects a broader societal issue. In an era where charisma...
Oh, this is where we generalize, because we're trying to dim the spotlight on Chris Langan as much as possible so we don't actually have to deal with the content of his theory. We just characterize it in some kind of way so we don't actually have to deal with the criticism against the propositions that we make against the CTMU, because we haven't actually said anything about the CTMU. So we generalize this. We make this about a big societal problem of which Chris Langan is a part. And that must necessarily render this criticism valid, right? No. Say something about the CTMU. Argue about a position. They're all philosophical principles. In the same way that you can argue against idealism, or you can make arguments against propositions that propositions that any other philosophers made, such as Immanuel Kant. You could argue against propositions that Hegel has made, and this is what the entirety of philosophy is about. It's about converging worldviews and foundations for worldviews. This is what the entirety of philosophy is. Now, are you going to be able to provide an argument just exactly like the entire philosophy does to a philosophical framework, or are you just going to keep misconstruing it as a scientific theory and saying, well, well, there's no scientific evidence for, there's no scientific theory, there's no scientific experiment testing the CTMU. It's like, it's like going up to a car and saying, why doesn't this car have wings? Why doesn't this car have wings? Where are the passenger seats for the flight in this car? It doesn't work like, it's a fucking car, idiot. It's not a plane. It's not an airplane.
Often outweighs credibility. Figures like Langan can gain significant influence despite lacking substantive contributions.
Substantive contributions? You've not demonstrated that any of his contributions into philosophy are not contributions into philosophy that are meaningful. Because you don't even know that it's a philosophy, even though you called it that. You still think it's a scientific theory. You still think that Chris Langan thinks it's a scientific theory, or has marketed it as such, or has said it is such. Straw man. This is called a straw man fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. Now, do you know what that is? Of course you don't, because you don't know what philosophy is. You don't understand logic, much like Professor Dave. Professor.
This phenomenon is particularly dangerous in areas like science and philosophy,
oh, this is where we get virtue
where the propagation
signaling.
of unverified ideas.
If we add the notion of virtue signaling, that we're morally righteous, and the capacity that we're pointing out this big problem in society of which Chris Langan is a part, then it becomes kind of minuscule and vague. Why Chris Langan would be a part of it, it just sort of becomes part of the background. It just is the case that Chris Langan is a part of it because there's a societal problem, and Chris Langan just fits within it. Have you justified why Chris Langan fits within it? No.
Can erode public trust in legitimate expertise. Furthermore, Langan's rhetoric often veers into conspiracy theories and ideological...
So this has nothing to do with the CTMU. Chris Langan has political positions irrelevant to the content of the CTMU. The CTMU... Let me tell you something. The CTMU doesn't say a single word about Christianity or Islam or religions or political ideology. The CTMU is a rigorous, metaphysical theory of everything, which is completely logically justified. And it does so. All of the logical justifications necessary for the CTMU to be made are contained within the CTMU and papers that Chris Langan have published. That's it. Bringing up Chris Langan's political opinions, whether valid or invalid, it doesn't matter, because the topic of the conversation is about whether he's made a meaningful contribution to his field, which is philosophy, and whether he's a charlatan. Now, he'd be a charlatan if he marketed his theory as a scientific theory, and he did the things that you said while marketing his theory as a scientific theory, which he hasn't, because the CTMU is not a scientific theory. You haven't been able to demonstrate that a single proposition within the CTMU is false. And I think my audience is getting a little bit tired of this because they keep hearing the same dumb fucking arguments over and over and over again. It would be refreshing to actually get a debate against the philosophical ideas of the CTMU.
Dogmatism, undermining his credibility as a rational thinker. His engagement with
In order for somebody to be a rational thinker, their theory needs to be scientifically testable, even if it's not a scientific theory. Do you see how that doesn't make sense? Do you see that it's a completely subjective category and criteria by which somebody can be determined to be serious or a charlatan? Unserious or a charlatan? Yeah, doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. Not just to me, it categorically doesn't make sense. And I'll be able to debate you on that if you ever have the balls to, stop hiding behind a fucking AI voice generator.
Controversial topics, such as race and intelligence, has drawn criticism for being both scientifically unfounded and ethically dubious.
These are erroneous propositions. These are not justified. And even if they were, it's not relevant to the CTMU. It's not relevant. It's not relevant. How many times do I have to? It's not relevant.
These pursuits suggest a willingness to exploit provocative subjects to maintain relevance, further supporting the argument.
Relevance? If Chris Langan really wanted to maintain relevance, why wouldn't he invest in his YouTube channel and consistently upload videos? Why wouldn't he be doing interviews with every person that has tried to get an interview with him? If that was the case, why would he be uploading videos and things on Substack for his community exclusively? Why would that be the case? To maintain relevance? You're stupid. I'm sorry.
That his intellectual persona is more performative than genuine. In summary,
performative. Okay, so we get a proposition about Chris Langan's intellectual capacity. Chris Langan has been verified to have the IQ scores that he does, to be exceptionally intelligent, on the basis of the fact that he did an IQ test literally on ABC News, unless you want to make the proposition that ABC News is conspiring, to which I'd say, who's the conspiracy theorist now? ABC News would be conspiring to conjure up Chris Langan, a Christian, a random guy, a random horse rancher, to be a exceptional genius. Yeah, I don't think so.
Chris Langan's purported intelligence is high. Intelligence alone does not equate to meaningful contribution or credibility.
Okay. Can you tell us how his contributions are not meaningful in the domain of philosophy? How they're false? This is, firstly, it's a subjective standard that you've set out that you haven't defined, that you haven't set out to be objective. Secondly, you haven't showcased any of the propositions of the CTMU to be false. Thirdly, you're falsely characterizing the CTMU as a scientific theory and then declaring that it is an indicator that he doesn't have any meaningful contributions.
His reliance on self-promotion, opaque theories, and a rejection of academic rigor casts doubt on his legacy. By elevating himself as a misunderstood genius while avoiding the scrutiny that validates true intellect.
He's not avoiding scrutiny. You're not giving any. Have you shown a single logical argument or syllogism against any of the logical propositions within the CTMU? Or are you just going to keep screaming, well, where's the experiment for infocognition? You lack a basic rudimentary understanding of philosophy, which is the domain of Chris's work. You don't have a basic understanding of any of these things.
Intellectual work. Langan fits the mold of a charlatan, someone whose reputation outpaces
the mold that you've created, that you have had absolutely zero justification for. Yeah, well, this concludes the video. I hope you guys have enjoyed me thoroughly debunking this idiot. I hope that he someday manages to get the courage to debate somebody like me on the topic of the CTMU, which he never would. And nobody that criticizes the CTMU or debunks Chris Langan. Notice they all say, I've debunked Chris Langan, or never the CTMU. I've debunked the CTMU. Yeah. Thank you guys for watching. There are going to be a lot of these kind of videos coming soon. I'm going to be doing a series of videos on Professor Dave because he's a fucking idiot. But I'm going to be taking a little bit of my time with that, so they're as maximally good as possible. Thank you guys for watching. Stay telic, and yeah, stay clear of idiots like this, or at least point them out.